it's kind of fun to do the impossible. And I love this quote from Walt Disney, because the first time that I heard it, it really inspired me. And I wanted to start with it because sort of before this year, I wasn't actually sure if I really wanted to design anymore. I was pretty tired, I was burnt out, I'd gone through a move to a different country. I moved from my home country of England to the Netherlands, where I live in Amsterdam now. I suffered a little bit with things like anxiety and depression. But when I heard that quote from Walt Disney, it kind of inspired me a little bit to push myself out of my own comfort zones, so try and push through that anxiety. And since then, I think that I've been trying to do the impossible myself. So I guess you could say that I've been on my own personal pilgrimage, both in and out of design, because this relates to design as well as my own personal life. And I've tried to put myself out of my comfort zone as much as possible. So earlier this year, even now, speaking at an audience in front of people that you don't know, for anyone who's done this before, they'll know that the first 5 minutes of this are absolutely terrifying, but you push through it. Or this picture, which was taken in Yosemite earlier this year, where I went bouldering, I went climbing. I'm actually really scared of heights, so that was also pretty terrifying. And this one, which was taken in Indonesia in November last year, which was the first time I'd gone on a solo trip by myself outside of Europe. And it took me about 4 hours to actually press the book button to actually book my flights to go on this trip, which was how nervous about it I felt and how impossible doing that felt to me. But through doing that, I ended up having kind of the time of my life. And then this year, I've tried to travel as much as possible, and I've visited 5 continents this year alone. And this is one of the sort of 3rd or 4th conferences that I've spoke at. And obviously, throughout all that, and the years previous to this, I've been working as a UX designer, or product designer, whatever you want to call it at the moment. And I think through trying to do these impossible things, pushing myself outside of my comfort zone, I've kind of discovered 4 things that really relate to me within design, and hopefully to you too. And I think that's how they relate to the future of UX and how we can move forward as a profession. So the first one of those is people. And naturally, I'm kind of introverted myself, and I used to think that I really didn't like people that much in general, at least on a broader spectrum. On a one-to-one conversation, it was fine, but being an introvert, these types of things scared me. And I think through traveling and putting myself outside of my comfort zone, I've started to realize that actually people really matter in everything that we do, especially as UX designers. And one of the things that I've come to sort of realize myself, I put my own quote up there just for a laugh, is that everyone is a user experience designer. And I think what I mean by that is that we all control in some way or another how others experience what's happening around us. And subconsciously, we're all designing the experiences that other people have whilst in our company. I have one example of that that's not really digital, but living in the Netherlands and moving to the Netherlands, if you've ever been there or ever visited a restaurant, you'll realize that the service in those restaurants is pretty terrible. You can wait for 20 minutes for someone to come and take your order. I've been in restaurants where I've actually had to go and get my own menu because no one brought one. No one even came to say hello or ask if I wanted a drink. And if you contrast that to somewhere like the US, for example, where as soon as you sit down, someone comes and brings you the menu, they ask what you want, if they can help you in any way. I think that's a really interesting parallel. You could call it customer service, but there's still a person involved, and that's why I think that people matter. Because if you translated that experience that I had in a restaurant in the Netherlands, which is pretty common, to any kind of app or any kind of product, and you had to wait 20 minutes to even do anything within that app, you'd probably delete it straight away. It would be the worst experience you could imagine. So when we talk about users, we call ourselves user experiences designers, but we should probably be talking about people instead of users. It makes it more real. It puts like a human face to that actual user. And I think it's also important to remember that as designers, we have to communicate with people every single day, whether that's with other designers, if you're asking for feedback on your work, just day-to-day type of stuff, whether it's product managers, whether it's the developers, or even just communicating to people that you've never met through the work that you put out there. So communication with people is really a key thing. And I love one example of this from a group of designers at Booking. They were working in a department that we call partner services, which means that they're involved with the design for all the tools that are sort of hotels, apartments, all those types of owners use on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, all of those user experience designers at Booking don't own hotels. Most of them don't own their own apartments. But they got away from their desks and decided, through their own initiative, that they wanted to go and spend a day working in a hotel to see what those people had to deal with every day to try and help build a better product through that. No one asked them to do that. That was just an internal initiative that they came up with. And some others that did own their own apartments decided to rent those out through the platform to see what kind of challenges they would face, the type of people they would have to interact with, what their day-to-day jobs actually looks like. And from that, we were able to gain sort of valuable insights that helped us to build a better product for those people. So, yeah, I think one of the key things that I'm trying to get there is that as a UX designer, it's really important to understand people. And you can do that in multiple ways. So the first one, sort of do your research, because research helps us to create empathy. Those Booking designers went out, did their research, did the day-to-day jobs that the people in those hotels were doing, and were able to empathize with the things that they were doing and try and build around their workflows instead of just trying to come up with something. So think about how you can put yourself in the shoes of other people. And the third thing on there is refresh your understanding of human behavior, basically. Just see what you can do within that. So, for example, in the US, the restaurant server, they were motivated for the tips that they were going to get, but actually through that, they provide a better user experience for their customers. In the Netherlands, the people working in the same space were not motivated. They didn't really get tips. It's not part of the culture. They didn't really care too much because they were going to get paid either way. So one sort of key takeaway that I have from that is sort of that people are the most important part of every experience. It's good to remember. The second thing, I've got 4 things that I want to talk about today, is that business is really important, and actually understanding the businesses that you're designing for really matters. So knowing how to use research and data, understanding how the designs that you create can positively or even negatively in some cases affect business, and being aware of the impact of your changes. And I like this quote from my friend Kev. He's a senior designer at Philips. He also lives in the Netherlands. But he says that good design is not how pretty the app is. If the business does not succeed, design has failed. And that was a quote from a conversation that I had with him recently when I was thinking about this talk. So I think it's important to remember when thinking about business that you're also coming at it from a UX perspective or a people perspective. And as designers, we're sometimes quick to judge when something doesn't look good on the outside. But actually, if it solves a problem for people and then creates a successful business, it's actually a really good design in that case, whether it visually looks nice or not. I think that's hard to argue with. And I think recently we've seen that sort of shift from UX to product design. And a product designer's role is basically to make the whole product successful. And I think that's where we get a great opportunity as designers, because we're then now expected to contribute to these strategic decisions, be involved with business, base our decisions on user insights, valid facts, intuition, like Tammy mentioned. And now we're asked to work a little bit more interdisciplinary. So across different roles, we're asked to work a little bit sometimes as copywriters with marketing and growth, all these different areas as businesses want to grow and succeed. But one sort of common misconception that I get when I'm talking about business with people or just having general chats is that it's always about money and focusing on money. But I think what I'm getting at when talking about business is that it shouldn't always be about money, and you shouldn't necessarily focus on that. If you think back to the people that you're designing for, focus on the problems. If you actually solve those problems for people and communicate it well with them how you're solving them, then the money is going to come anyway. And I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by that. So, does anyone remember Napster? Just stand up if you remember Napster. A few people standing up, a few hands going up. Yeah, it was awesome, right? I miss it, or at least I missed it then. For those that don't know, Napster was basically peer-to-peer sharing program where you could, at that time, illegally share files with other people. We all knew that we're using it, that it was legal, but we loved it because it solved a really good problem for us in that we were able to get these different types of files, we were able to get the music that we wanted. At the time, it was just an awesome piece of software. And then this band came along and had something to say about it. If anyone doesn't know this band, it's Metallica. I actually really like Metallica. And they had a right to be annoyed, I guess. People were actually illegally sharing their music. But they kind of got everything wrong when it came to Napster and their argument against it and their fight against it. And here's why. So there were multiple things that Metallica couldn't see when people were using Napster. And that was sort of the potential for an awesome user experience that it provided people, because it was convenient. You could easily just share files with each other. I mean, back in 1999 when it launched, the internet sucked, so it took you a long time to get those files, but it was still more convenient than going out to a shop and having to buy and find those records. It was also how people wanted to consume content online. So there's that convenience factor coming in again. And also, the third thing was kind of the potential that it created for new fans to even discover them. So if you'd never heard of Metallica, but your friend uploaded it and was sharing it, there was a chance that you were going to download it and then discover that file. But things that Metallica could see when they were dealing with Napster was just money, and the thought that they were going to lose it. But in reality, they weren't really losing that much. They gained a lot of fans through it, and then at some point in time probably turned off a lot of those fans with their outrage against it. But Napster also wasn't beautiful software, but it did an awesome job of connecting people. And actually, if they'd been a little bit more future thinking with that at the time, they could have done some of the things that are being done now. So services like Apple Music, Spotify, Tidal, all those services have come about. They were more future thinking. They saw how those users wanted to consume content, and they solved that problem for people and actually provided a lot of value to them. So there's a huge business benefit because of that, and they were not necessarily just focusing on the money aspect at the time. And one other thing that I find with business and when I'm talking about business is that people are unsure where to start, like how do they get involved with understanding business? And the main thing I say is just to ask more questions. So if you aren't sure about what you're doing in that sector, ask questions to understand the problem, ask questions to understand the business goals better. Go for lunch with the business people even. Just sit with them, have a chat, see what their intentions are and what they're trying to do, and empathize with them. Do your research. And I love this quote. It's another quote from Brian Grazer. He's an award-winning producer of movies. But he says, life isn't about finding the answers, it's about asking the questions. And the reason I love this is because if you ask the right questions, then answers are going to come to you anyway. So ask questions, gather that data. Be curious, and it will foster cooperation with other people and help you make connections with other people too. And actually, this was one thing that I really didn't do when I was first starting out. So it's another restaurant story. I seem to have a lot of those. But when I was first starting out, I got a task. I was working in an agency at that time. I got a task from my creative director to design a restaurant website. If you've heard me speak before, you might have heard this story before, but basically, I went away, I designed this website, I thought it looked beautiful, but I didn't ask any questions. I just read the brief, went and created this thing, came back, and was like, here's my work, it's awesome. My creative director looked at me and kind of went, well, this is shit. And that was mostly because I didn't do any research. I didn't really know that much about the restaurant. I didn't ask any questions to find out what their goals were with actually having that website. Were they trying to just have somewhere for a menu? Did they want bookings through that? Like, I didn't ask any of those questions. So it's really key to just ask more questions, especially on the business side of things. And I think, understanding business is my second point. So sort of be forward thinking and less critical of bad design. Napster wasn't a great design, but it was an awesome piece of software, and the UX was amazing. So just because something might not look nice doesn't mean that it doesn't help others. I think if you understand the business goals as well, then you can positively affect business in a good way. That is also good. It helps keep you in a job, for example. It gets you invited to strategic discussions. So you now then have a seat at the table because you're speaking the same language as the business people that are trying to do their job and grow the business. And it helps you empathize with them. But I think ultimately, sort of put people first in that situation. Like, money isn't everything, but you can make a lot of it through great UX. But if I have one sort of key takeaway from that section, it's just aim to understand how your designs can impact the business you're designing for in a positive way. And I think you'll do a lot of good if you do that. The third point that I want to talk about is storytelling. So storytelling has been a fairly big buzzword, I guess, over the last 2 years, but it's really important. And I'm going to explain why. Throughout this presentation even, I've been telling you sort of little stories along the way, and hopefully, as I've told them, you've been a little bit more engaged with what I'm saying. And storytelling can really help you bridge that gap between people and business, which is why I think it's super important. And for me, as kind of an introvert from a small village in England, like, I didn't think it would be possible for me to stand up on stage and talk to a group of people. That's kind of my story. And we respond to stories because they sort of create this emotion, like inner emotion inside of us. It's just a natural reaction that we have. They've been passed down over time. Like, if you think back to stories such as the Trojan War, for example, or I don't have any Polish-specific examples, but for like British people traveling to America in the 1700s. As much as we like to consume other people's stories, we like to tell our own. And I think that's why things like this, Instagram stories, Facebook stories, all the big apps have been adding story features. And they've been so successful because they meet that inherent need that we have to tell stories and consume other people's stories. People clearly want to do that. But that doesn't mean you have to go and add a story feature to your app. I think we've got enough of them. But think about ways that you can tell stories for your brand, your product, whatever it might be, and provide value to people from that. And I've got one example that I think is a really great example of a storyteller. And this is a guy called Peter Levels. I don't know if people know him, but he created Nomad List. But not only does he have great headshots, like this one, he found ways to connect with people online. And one of the ways that he did that when he started out was talking about creating 12 startups in 12 months. That was his story that he put out there. He'd quit his job. He was going to try and start 12 startups in 12 months, which was one startup every month, which seemed like an impossible task. But the story was engaging enough that it got people interested in his projects and what he was doing. Through that, he was able to build multiple businesses. I don't even think he managed 12, actually. I think he got 3 or 4 in and hit on 2 or 3 really good ideas, and then he put everything into them. And another way that he is great at storytelling is that he gets everyone involved with what he's doing. He tweets everything he does. He puts polls out there. He asks questions to his audience to try and solve their problems for them. So I think if one person can do it by themselves, then brands could also be doing a much better job. Products could also be doing a much better job of this too. One of the questions I get asked when I talk about storytelling is like, well, that's great, but what's the relation between that and UX design? And I really like this sort of diagram, which covers it. And I think if you look at this, there's a classic story structure that pretty much all stories have, and there's 5 key points to that. So there's the beginning, there's some kind of conflict, which is the problem. There's the rising action, the falling action, and the outcome. And I think, yeah, if you sort of put yourself in anyone's shoes or the shoes of any person, we all go through that at different times. And there's always problems that we come across, whatever we're doing. And if we put ourselves in those shoes, we sort of travel across an app or a product or whatever in that story, and we create the story of a user experience unfolding over time. And I think this quote from Jared Spool is a really great one too around that. So if you're unsure how to think about that, just look at this quote. So when companies talk about features, they're saying, look at us, look at what we can do. But when companies talk about the problems of customers, they're saying, look at what you're dealing with, look at how we want to help. And that's where the storytelling part comes in. If you don't know Jared, he's probably worth following on Twitter. He's a great thought leader in the UX space. He starts really interesting discussions like this one. I don't always agree with him, but that's what makes it interesting. So understanding stories can really help us when we move forward. People have that internal trigger that makes them respond to them. You can use stories to connect the dots between people and business. Peter Levels did that with his 12 startups in 12 months. He was connecting his story with the businesses that he was creating. And think about how you can tell stories around the people that use your product or app or brand or whatever that might be. But if there's one key takeaway from that, I also think that the better we get at storytelling, the better that we get at communicating our work to other people too. And I mentioned that there were 4 things. There are 3 of them. And I think if you add these 3 things together, you get the 4th one, which is value. And by combining these 3 things, you can provide that incredible value for people. So for me, the future of UX is really creating value for people. Despite those couple of years ago for me where I thought that I didn't really want to design anymore, I'm actually all in on design right now. I'm so excited about the future. There's so many fun things to play with. So many different ways to create value for other people. As Sam mentioned yesterday in his talk, hope that you were there for that one, phones are with us everywhere. People are on the go all the time. They have them everywhere they go. It's not just limited to desktop anymore. There's so much cool technology to utilize. So we get to play around with things like augmented reality, virtual reality, the default software development kits that comes with phones, for example. And people are just starting out in that space, which makes it a really exciting time as designers to be involved with that. Like Temi mentioned as well, as designers, we get to use our intuition. Like, we actually are the ones that get to use our intuition to design things of value for other people. And when we combine that with data, we can just go to great places. And I think another thing that is really, really awesome about this period in time especially, is that experiences are also moving offline. And experiences are starting to unfold over time. So before, you might have to just go to a desktop, sit down, log onto a website. That's your experience when we're talking about user experience design. We're not limited to that anymore. You can be out anywhere. You have your phone with you. There's things like Amazon Go coming along where they looked at the UX of a supermarket and they redefined it. They looked at the people, like, we're busy. We don't want to stand in the queue at a checkout, because why should we? From a business perspective, something like this saves supermarkets massive amounts of money on staffing costs. From a storytelling point of view, there's the cross-channel experience there from the Amazon brand that allows people to be part of the Amazon story, but also create their own story with Amazon at the same time. And obviously there's a lot of value in that, because then you can shop, go about your day. And it shouldn't just be Amazon Go doing this stuff too. There's also all the voice software happening at the moment. That's another area for us to get involved with as user experience designers, like Alexa, all the wearable tech. I heard there was some questions about that in one of the other talks yesterday, like how can we involve this? All that stuff is going to be awesome. And I started with Walt Disney, because I think Walt Disney was one of the first people that actually combined all of these things. There's obviously quite a few stories about him when it comes to design online. Some people would consider him the sort of first real user experience designer. And I think Walt Disney combined all the sort of 3 things that we've spoken about today. So people, business, storytelling, and through that created value for a lot of people. So that was the children that attended the Disneyland parks. They loved it. Adults who saw the joy that it brought their kids. Adults who worked in the park. It created jobs for them. And that's evolved over time too. So initially you could go to Disneyland as a child. They would give you a hat and you'd have your name written on your hat. And then you would walk along and all the characters would introduce you by your name because they could see it on the hat. Now they're doing crazy stuff with sort of wearable technologies. They can know in advance like which cartoon characters from Disney you actually like or not, so that they can tailor and make that experience personalized, so that that child has their own story within the Disneyland theme park, which I think is really fun. So if I think back to the quote that I started with at the beginning, with it's kind of fun to do the impossible, that task obviously felt impossible for Walt Disney at the time. But he found a way to do it, and he found the fun in that and saw the value that it created for people. And he realized that those experiences can happen over time everywhere, and that's where having a focus on storytelling can really help. It helped him grow his business. Obviously, Disney is huge. It provided massive value for people in all different ways. So I think one of the things that I like everyone to think about moving forward from this is that how can you create value for yourself and other people? And how can you do the impossible yourself? For me, 2 years ago, last year, I thought I didn't want to design anymore, but actually now I'm super excited about doing it. I think there's so much potential out there for all of us in this room as designers to just create incredible value for people, grow businesses, even make our own businesses in some case. We've never really had that opportunity in the past. And I think now is an amazing time to do that. So think about that. How can you do the impossible in your life? What will it take for you to get there? And how can you create that value? And that's it. Thank you, Mobiconf. Any questions? We have some time left over, so if there are any, feel free. If not, then I think it's early lunch. No? Oh, there's one up there, I think.
Just out of curiosity, the story about, I really like the example with Napster. So I'm curious if you were part of Metallica back then and you were more forward thinking, what would you have designed to compete with Napster? Because I feel that something like Spotify wouldn't have worked back then.
Yeah, maybe that's a good point. But I think there were, or at least I could see that there was an inherent need for people for that technology. The fact that Napster got so big so fast, like stated that that was possible. Maybe it would have been tricky at that point in time to convince people to pay for that type of thing, which places like Spotify and Tidal, Apple Music, they're all doing now, as people had access to that for free. But what I would have liked to have seen from Metallica at that point in time was probably some more forward thinking. I think the record industry as a whole at that point in time couldn't see past this sort of physical hardware, let's say, so CDs, whatever it might be. And if they'd been a little bit more future thinking, a little bit more forward thinking, that it could have looked at what value software like that actually provided with people and worked with that company or built something separate to actually figure out those user needs. So yeah, that's sort of my take on it.
Good point. Thank you for the talk.
Thanks for the question.
I think that's it.
Okay, thank you.